Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm coming to you with a Jane Austen July video. And last year I finished all of Jane Austen's 6 novels. And so I did kind of a tier ranking video of them last year. I ranked her novels from worst to best. And this year I thought I would rank her leading men. And this is going to be totally and completely personal to me, what I'm interested in, both romantically and in terms of what I enjoy reading when I am reading kind of a romance storyline. I don't think that I'm gonna spoil anything here. I might spoil a bit of the characterization of the guys, so if you're worried about that, come back when you finished all of Jane Austen's novels, but let's just get right into this. At the bottom of my list is the leading man, the love interest that I think is probably at the bottom of most people's lists, and that's Edmund from Mansfield Park. Edmund's crime is not so much that he's an unlikable person, it's that he's a very forgettable person. Now, I do have problems with Edmund, and I have a lot of problems with things that he does to the main character, Fanny, kind of in the second half of the novel. He does do some things that I, as a reader, don't like, that I, as a fan of Fanny, don't like. To me, the things that I don't like about him could have been forgiven, but throughout the book, you know that Fanny, the main character, kind of has feelings for Edmund. You know that pretty clearly. But I would say that also throughout the book, you're never quite clear on what Edmund's feelings are. And so you're never exactly sure of what he thinks of Fanny, of other female characters, of his own self. And I think his greatest crime, his greater crime than any of those, is the fact that he is ultimately forgettable. What is Edmund's characterization? But perhaps Edmund's greatest crime is not that he really overlooks Fanny, it's that he's pretty much a wet blanket. He's a very boring character. And when the book is done, Edmund falls pretty flat. He's actually very forgettable, because I would say Mansfield Park is filled with probably the most dynamic characters from Jane Austen's kind of oeuvre, and Edmund is really the one that falls short compared to the other characters. I think Fanny, I think the Crawfords, I think Mrs. Norris, I think they're all really layered and dynamic characters, and Edmund feels very one note. So on a personal level, am I into Edmund? No, he's a bit boring even for me, but as a reader, I'm also really not intrigued by Edmund. His love story is not one that I feel invested in. And number 5, we have Edward Ferrars from Sense and Sensibility. Now, Sense and Sensibility has 2 leading men, and so the other will show up later on this list, but Edward suffers from the same thing that Edmund does, and that's that he's just a little bit forgettable. I think Edward is sweet in a way and very charming in a way that Edmund is not, and so it does kind of make him rise a little bit higher for me, but on the whole, he is a fairly forgettable character. And again, I would say that Sense and Sensibility is a book that is filled with a lot of really memorable characters, and thus he falls short. But Edward is also not really in the large majority of the book. And so you kind of wonder, would you have more of a handle on his character? Would you like him better if you had read more about him, if he had appeared more frequently? And so I hate to put him this far down the list, but I also don't think there was any other place for him. I really feel like the characterization that he has in my head has come from Hugh Grant playing him in the Ang Lee movie in 1995. So I don't really know how much of that was Hugh Grant's kind of innate charm and how much of it was actually the character of Edward Ferrars, if that makes any sense. On a personal level, would I go out with Edward? Yes, I think he's very charming and I think he's very polite. I do think he probably needs to stand up for himself a bit more. I think he needs to be a little bit more honest. And I am a Sagittarius, and so I am a very kind of honest person, and I don't really like people kind of bandying about a bit. I know the reason that Edward is not very forthcoming with certain things is basically down to the time period in which he is living. So maybe if he was living today, I wouldn't have that kind of issue with him. But I think there are things in this book that could have been solved by having a legitimate conversation. As a reader, I don't get very much out of him because I don't feel like there's very much of him in the book. So it's very hard for me to feel attached to Edward, if that makes any sense. Next, I have my most controversial opinion, and this one is very, very personal. So next up, I have Mr. Darcy, and probably on a personal level, Darcy goes farther down for me than either Edward Ferrars or Edmund, because Darcy is very, very like me. And I know that that would really get on my nerves. It could go one of two ways. Either Darcy and I would really hate each other, or Darcy and I would really get on. Because I do get the sense that Darcy is somebody who would leave you alone, who would let you have some personal space, and I'm somebody who really, really does not like clingy people. Again, this kind of goes back to being a Sagittarius. I really don't like people who have to have all of your time, who don't have any other interests. And so I do feel like Darcy would give you space. And I feel like he would allow you to have your own interests. But Darcy is very introverted and unsociable in a way that is very rude. And for me, in my head, going throughout this book, there are comments that he makes that he could not come back from. If he said those things to me, if I overheard him saying those things about me and about my family, there is no way that I would ever forget about them. I won't say I wouldn't forgive him. I probably would forgive him, but I don't forget things like that. And so I think in the back of my mind, in this hypothetical scenario where Darcy and I are going out, I would be thinking the entire time, every family get together, does he still hate my family? Does he think my family is silly? Does he think my sisters are stupid? And I just wouldn't be able to get past that, probably. Hate to love is a very hard sell for me in fiction, but it certainly is in real life. And I understand it's that way for a lot of people, but it would never work that way with me because I just don't forget stuff like that. And I would always be thinking, would you revert back to being mean, to being rude like that? And I get the sense that Darcy probably would. So if Darcy asked me out, I would say yes. It would be a short-term relationship, no doubt, because we would probably want to kill each other. But from a reader's perspective, I think Darcy is more compelling than the other two that I've mentioned so far. You get quite a bit of Darcy in Pride and Prejudice, and you get almost more of a handle on his character than you do on Elizabeth's, which I think is really interesting. He is somebody who really stands out in classic literature, and I think there's a reason his name is so famous. So from a reader's perspective, he is very, very compelling. From a personal perspective, I just know it wouldn't work out. Next up, I have Captain Wentworth. I really didn't know where to put him. I'll just be honest, I didn't really know where to put him. From a reader's perspective, he's one of the most interesting to me because this story is probably one of the most interesting of Jane Austen's novels to me. I think it is a really introspective and very character-driven novel. But I'll say some of my feelings on the other male characters come from the fact that I have seen adaptations of the works, and I think sometimes that really helps me. It especially helps me with Jane Austen, but it really helps me to conceptualize a character and put a face to a name because I don't feel like Jane Austen gives you very much in way of description. And I have seen one adaptation of Persuasion, and I wasn't all that enthused with it. It was with Kieran Hinds, and I really love Kieran Hinds, but I don't know that he's right for Captain Wentworth in my head. From both a personal and a reader perspective, Wentworth is very, very interesting, and he's very compelling because he is somebody who's in it for the long game. He is somebody who is in it for the long term, and he also has a very long memory. He doesn't forget things. He doesn't forget slights against him. And so there's a lot of angst in this book that is really fun to read, and that I think is also very realistic. I think it's something that makes Wentworth very compelling as a romantic partner. And probably the point of highest romance for me in any of Jane Austen's novels comes at the end of this book from Wentworth, a letter from Wentworth. And it is so utterly beautiful. I'm itching to see a new adaptation of Persuasion because I do think it would probably make Wentworth rise a bit in my estimation to see him played by maybe a different actor. So I think Wentworth might move up for me later on, but my top three are my top three. So on a personal level, would I go out with Wentworth? Yeah, I probably would. And from a reader's perspective, I think Wentworth is very compelling. I think this is a book that you really want to keep reading because you want to know how that will turn out. I spent a lot of time switching my top three all around. And so this is kind of how I feel today. This is kind of how I feel right at this moment in time, but ask me tomorrow and I would probably feel differently. But at number 3, I have Mr. Knightley from Emma. Emma is my favorite of Jane Austen's novels, and I think sentimentally, Mr. Knightley is probably my favorite of her leading men. The reason that I put Knightley lower down than first or second place is because I do think he has the tendency to criticize Emma. Now, Emma needs some criticizing, definitely, but I think he does it in a way that is very, very harsh at certain points in the book. And so I don't necessarily think that's either compelling to me as a reader or personally. At the same time, though, Knightley definitely is somebody who is on equal footing with Emma and is probably the only person that she would take that kind of thing from. And so Knightley is one that I think is very, very alluring. The portrayal of him in the 2020 Emma film was just absolutely incredible. And I think it smoothed some of Knightley's edges a little bit because there is kind of a strange age gap in Emma that really stuck out for me when reading it, and it doesn't feel very apparent at all in any of the adaptations to me, but it felt very apparent in the book that Knightley was a grown man and Emma was still a girl. And so while that was definitely acceptable at the time, it's kind of a weird thing to read. I have a similar thing with Mansfield Park because Edmund is literally Fanny's cousin, and it is something that sticks out to me pretty blatantly in the book, and so it's hard to wrap my brain around, and I think I have a similar thing here. And the reason that it sticks out here to me and maybe not in other books is because I do think Knightley uses his age against Emma, let's say. He uses his expertise and his knowledge against the fact that Emma has probably never really experienced things outside of town. And I think that works very well because there is a real tension between Knightley and Emma throughout the book that is really wonderful to read. From a reader's perspective, it doesn't get any better than this. I really, really love Knightley. But I also found myself when I was reading this for the first time and watching the film for the first time, I felt like Knightley could have gotten with a couple of other characters and I would have been just as happy with that. And that's when I knew I just really liked Knightley as a character. So on a personal level, would I go out with Knightley? Yes. And as a reader, am I compelled by Knightley? Do I think Knightley is romantic? Yes. This is another one that has probably one of the most romantic lines to me. So I really love Knightley, and most days I think I would tell you he's probably number 1 for me. But number 2 today is Henry Tilney from Northanger Abbey. This is probably my truest answer personally. Henry Tilney is the character, is the Jane Austen leading man that I would go out with and that I think I would probably really get on with. I think we would have a great relationship because he has a real sense of humor. He's very charming, he's very witty, and I just think that he really would work well with me personally. And as a reader, Northanger Abbey used to be my favorite until I read Emma. And so I have returned to Northanger Abbey many, many times. And I think the reason that I do is because of the relationship between Tilney and Catherine Morland. And I think it's because there is a light-hearted aspect to their relationship and to the book in general that makes it really easy to read. And that's the sense I get about Tilney, is that everything is easy. It's easy to like him, it's easy to fall in love, it's easy to have fun with him, it's easy to live with him. He feels very refreshing for me amongst classic literature and certainly among Jane Austen's leading men. Tilney is maybe not the most overtly romantic of all of Jane Austen's leading men, but that's probably why I like him. If men were writing letters and talking the way that they did, in these books in Jane Austen's day, then I would probably be more of a romantic than I am. But I am definitely not somebody who's very sappy, who gets all into kind of romance, things like that. And so once again, I kind of think Henry Tilney is very pared down, and I just think that that would work really well for me personally. And as a reader, I also really enjoy him. There are lines he says that always make me laugh out loud. So he is my second choice. But number one, my favorite of Jane Austen's leading men is Colonel Brandon from Sense and Sensibility. And just hear me out, listen to me, okay? I know this is another one with a very weird age gap, and I also struggle with that. But I feel like Brandon is a very classy, educated gentleman, and he never really buys into all of the drama that's going on and throughout the novel. He's never somebody who gets hung up on that. He doesn't even get offended by things that happen throughout the novel, because you get the sense that he understands it. He's been there before. He's old enough to remember when he felt like that. And so he doesn't really hold things against the other characters, and I really, really respect that. He's just there for them. He's a very caring man, and while there is a big age gap between him and the character that he winds up with, it is potentially one of my favorite romances in Jane Austen, because I think it works so well. And the character that he is kind of linked to is a character that I have grown to sympathize with more and more over the years. Even though I don't think I'm very much like her, I think she craves passion, but she also really craves poetry and literature. And that is why Colonel Brandon is my number one. He makes presents of books to her. He quotes poetry with her. There's a really, really wonderful scene in, again, the 1995 Ang Lee adaptation, where they are sitting on the lawn and both reading poetry. And so personally, would I go out with Colonel Brandon? Yes. He's 35. 35 is not that big of an age gap to me. And as a reader, I think he's really compelling. There's also kind of a mystery aspect to Sense and Sensibility that unfolds very interestingly with his character. And I'm really, really invested in the romance with him. Sense and Sensibility is one where when you're reading it for the first time, and I felt this way anyway, you're not quite sure who is going to wind up with who. There are multiple different ways that it could go, and you're interested in all of those different ways. And so Sense and Sensibility is one that has risen for me in the past year. I used to put it at the bottom of my list of Jane Austen's novels. I used to think it was the worst of her novels, and now I don't think so. I really, really like Sense and Sensibility, and I personally really love Colonel Brandon. Please tell me down below your list of Jane Austen's leading men. I would love to know your ranking of Jane Austen's leading men. Who would you go out with? Who would you date? And who as a reader do you think is the most compelling? Is there somebody who you really like as a reader, but you know you personally wouldn't get on with? Because that is definitely me with Mr. Darcy. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.